Turn on our recording. All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm so excited you can be here with me today. I'm Erin Owens. I'm a professor in the Newton Gresham Library here at Sam Houston State. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about AI in its relation to scholarly research and publishing. So a few housekeeping notes to start off. As I said, I am going to be recording the session. I will share both the slides and the video afterwards. They'll be posted at this address that's on the screen. So feel free to just grab a quick snapshot of that if you want, but I will also send an email out with a link to those resources so that you can refer back to these. I'm going to have a lot of links and things in here to a lot of stories so that you can go a little more in depth on some of these emerging issues if you're interested in that. Also, I want to start off with a little bit of a caveat just to say that I am not necessarily an expert on this topic at all. I'm not a computer programmer. I'm not an expert in machine learning. So I may not have answers to questions about all of the technological detail about how these AI tools work. I'm also going to be touching on some legal questions and issues surrounding these. And I do also want to start with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert. So I'm going to be highlighting some questions, some concerns, but I am not authorized to make any sorts of predictions about where these things are going to fall out legally as things continue. All right. So getting started, kind of what is artificial intelligence, to get us just briefly started with some definitions here. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as the ability of a computer or computer-controlled robot to perform tasks that are commonly associated with intelligent beings. And it goes on to say that this is usually applied in the context of intellectual processes like being able to reason, discover meaning, generalize, and learn from past experience. I've also got this slightly more nuanced definition from Aruna Patam that talks about distinguishing AI on the basis of the amount of data that it's capable of processing in order to then take those intellectual steps, like reasoning, making decisions, finding patterns, and making judgments. And she explains that capacity to process a lot of data to do something with, that's why AI is at the foundation of things like image recognition and predictions for all sorts of things, whether it's just predicting how traffic light systems ought to be patterned, or corporations predicting when you're going to get coffee in the morning so that they can market to you more specifically. So within this broader world of AI, I think unless you've been living under a rock recently, you've probably heard references to ChatGPT. This is kind of the big new thing that exploded on the scene right at the end of 2022. So what is ChatGPT? Essentially, it's an online artificial intelligence chatbot. It was created by a company called OpenAI and released in December 22. It is astonishing to me to think that it is still that new, that recent, when we've been hearing so much about it. Now, that being said, this is far from the first chatbot that we've ever seen. If you have used a customer service tool on a company website to ask questions about an order, about shipping, things like that, you've probably interacted with some level of chatbot. But ChatGPT represents a significant advance over the technology that we've seen up till now. Now, even though ChatGPT as the chatbot itself is fairly new, it is built on technology that's been around a little longer. So it's built on the GPT-3 language model. That version of the language model actually came out in 2020, and that's based on two previous versions that came out in 2019 and 2018. Rumors are already circulating about GPT-4 that's in development, which I think we're expecting out sometime in 23, 24, but without a hard date. So we're a few steps along in the evolution of this language model, with that process looking to continue as we go into the future. So what kinds of things are users doing with ChatGPT? Some of you may have played around with it a little bit. You may have tried to log in and seen its messages about being at capacity. It's definitely been very busy and hard to get in sometimes of day because there's been so much demand. So what are people finding to do with this AI chatbot? I wanted to highlight a few of these, kind of showing the range and also trying to show the ridiculousness that some of this is getting to. So obviously people are asking questions, getting some factual information, using it to compose emails, compose short essays without citations, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail later. They report having human-like conversations. And I laughed at this one poster who said they've had a 30-minute conversation with ChatGPT about their cat. One user used it to rewrite Act 1, Scene 1 of the famous play Death of a Salesman, substituting Elsa from Frozen in the place of Willy Loman. The results are hilarious. I highly recommend going and reading that one. That's funny. Another person composed biblical style verses on removing a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR. Also worth reading. I laughed till I cried. Co-authoring children's books with vaguely terrifying illustrations, which I've included here. This is an AI generated story with AI generated illustrations. And clearly the AI is not that great at depicting fingers. So we have a very happy child typing on her computer with a broken pinky finger. There's been a lot of arrows fired at this book online. People are definitely using these tools to debug computer code, which is awesome, and to write malware, which is slightly less awesome because it can do it pretty well and pretty fast. We haven't necessarily seen this yet, but there have been some security reports expressing great concern about the potential for these tools to be used to create really cheap, really large-scale influence campaigns. So if we think about all of the social media propaganda and disinformation that's been happening around some of the past presidential campaigns, these kinds of tools could exponentially increase that just by making it so much faster and easier to create propaganda information that can target individual users. One gentleman tried unsuccessfully to use ChatGPT to represent him as an attorney to fight traffic tickets. The state of California said nope on that one. And people have even been using ChatGPT to write letters to help them break up with their romantic partners. So it really is sort of amazing the sheer diversity of things people are coming up with for this tool to do for them. Now, DALL-E is the other tool that I put in the title of this presentation. So what is DALL-E? This is an AI art generator. You put in text, you type in words describing what you want to see in an image, and it creates a digital image that it thinks matches your text input. This is also created by AIs, or OpenAI. So this is by the same makers of ChatGPT. But it's not the only AI image generator out there right now. So other names you may see are Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, Crayon, Generi. There's a bunch of these circulating out there, and they are already becoming very integrated into free mainstream tools like TikTok and Canva, the graphics designer. So what kinds of things are users doing with these AI art generators? I wanted to answer that question by showing you a few random examples of some things that I asked one of these tools to create for me. So first I asked it for an impressionistic painting of a black cat riding on a skateboard. I'm not sure in what context I would need this painting, but it gave it to me quite successfully. Here's a cartoon image of neurons in the human brain. Sometimes it is vastly less successful with these requests, as in this third example. I asked it for a scientific diagram of the human heart. Anyone who has taken a biology class will hopefully find that diagram as amusing as I did. I laughed a lot when it made that one. So it puts together what it thinks matches your words, but definitely that accuracy, how thoroughly it understands the question, how it chooses to interpret the word heart can lead to varied results. Now, there's also a world of other AI tools out there. I'm really going to be focusing more on that textual and visual content creation, but it is worth noting that there's a number of tools now for generating computer code and helping to write it, where you, again, write out a text prompt describing what you want your code to do, and it generates that code for you. And then OpenAI, who made ChatGPT and DALL-E, they are in the process of developing a similar tool that would use text prompts to create 3D models. Ordinarily, using 3D modeling programs is, this much more complicated task that people have to learn how to do. So this, you can really just see the potential for this growing rapidly. So shifting our focus then to research in particular, because this is really where I want to focus. What kinds of things are we seeing researchers doing with AI tools? I want to start out with a poll that was done asking researchers whether researchers should be allowed to use tools like ChatGPT to help them write academic papers. Now, you will see the majority of them said no. Almost 60% said no, we don't think that's appropriate. But there's this other 37% that said yes. So there are people out there who are seeing potential benefit of using these tools to help them write paper. So I want to kind of look at what can we do with it? What are some of the possible benefits, and what are some of the possible risks that we need to be aware of? So some of the things that we're already seeing academic researchers do, there's been a whole study looking at using ChatGPT to write papers that have been judged acceptable for publishing in academic journals in finance. We've seen a nursing education journal publish an editorial that was co-authored with ChatGPT. You can actually go and read that editorial in PubMed and see ChatGPT as a cited PubMed author. Listing ChatGPT in article bylines as a co-author in full articles. And we've even had one instance of researchers publishing a paper about ChatGPT, co-authored with ChatGPT. They even went through the process during submitting for publication of asking ChatGPT whether it had conflicts of interest. I don't actually know that that paper's been published, but they wrote in great detail about the process that they went through to author this paper and to submit it for attempted publication. And it's just really fascinating seeing how you navigate these questions of ChatGPT being an author. Can it be an author? What does that really entail? So this is just some of the stuff we've already seen happening in this brief space since ChatGPT came out in December. This was another one that cropped up recently. There was a live webinar demonstrating how you can use ChatGPT to help with systematic reviewing. I was very disappointed that I had a conflict and could not attend this, but I'm really hoping there will be a recording because I'm very keen to see what it is that they're proposing here, what kinds of strategies they're suggesting. So people are really finding creative use cases for this all over the place. Now, it is worth noting in terms of scholarly publishing that AI is already in this space, right? We've got tools that support article writing, article submission, screening of manuscripts, and also doing things like method checking and image checking during a peer review process. So even before ChatGPT proper has come out, AI is in the scholarly publishing space. But as these new tools continue to proliferate and researchers continue to come up with these new novel use cases, this may present new risks. And so scholarly publishers are really going to need to be staying at the forefront of this space, thinking about what kinds of legal risks there may be around automated decision-making processes, looking at reviewing and making decisions on manuscripts with AI tools, and also managing bias. If you have tools that are maybe predicting whether a paper is a good choice to publish, whether it's going to be well cited and have strong impact and all of these things, really asking yourself, where is that decision coming from in the AI's programming and training? And is it possible that it reflects biases that already exist in the historical publishing data, or biases that are coming in from the programmers and systems that have generated this tool? So some of the benefits, I think, it's one of those things that I don't want to just say, AI is evil, run away and don't look at it. I think there are spaces in which there are potential ways that researchers could use this to their advantage. So a few of the things that are kind of going around that caught my attention: helping to get a draft started. I know for myself as a writer, that blank page at the beginning of the process is really intimidating. And a lot of people may have trouble getting over that hump of getting words on the page. Once you have some words there, it's a little easier to get rolling and start to revise them, rewrite them, and move forward with what you want to say. So there are some interesting use cases here for tools like Moonbeam, where you can put in some really simple bullet points of some things you need to say. It will start generating smooth flowing paragraphs, and then you may completely tear that apart. You may end up using nothing of what it wrote, but it may help you just to get those words on the page as a starting point. There is some potential for AI tools to help speed up some writing tasks. Things like writing abstracts after a paper's done. That's writing a good abstract is a process that challenges a lot of researchers, and things like ChatGPT seem to be pretty decent at that. Also, there's a really interesting piece here in the conversation about testing ChatGPT's ability to synthesize existing research information to help generate a question for new research to pursue. And they were able to demonstrate that it's actually a surprisingly good tool for generating those research questions. One thing I think is an important possibility from an equity perspective is assisting researchers who are writing outside of their native language. So if English isn't your first language, but English is what you're expected to write in to publish, using a tool like ChatGPT or something similar to run your own original text through it and ask it to help you smooth out grammatical errors, things like that. I think there's some potential there for using that tool in a way that helps you without replacing, without substituting your original ideas and words. Of course, thinking about those art generators, there's some opportunities here when you need images to help illustrate your research concepts. It can take time and money to do it yourself or to hire someone else to do it. So maybe having one of these tools that can quickly and inexpensively generate unique images for you to illustrate your research concepts could be helpful. And then thinking about those human-like conversations, it can also function simply as a place to talk through our ideas, somebody to bounce ideas off of. When we're having trouble taking a complicated idea, breaking it down into simple terms, being able to do that back and forth with a chatbot might actually help us to clarify our thoughts and find a good way to express what we're working on. So there are some potential benefits, but we are working within the framework of some limitations. And particularly as we see, our students getting very excited about these tools, I think it is important for us to be clearly aware going in of what these limitations are. So just to highlight some of the key ones, right now, as ChatGPT is programmed, it cannot search the internet. It only knows the information that's included in its training data, but it's a closed system. Now we are seeing this move towards rapid change. You may have already seen recently that Microsoft has released a beta of their Bing search engine that has ChatGPT technology integrated so that you can chat with the search. So I think we're going to very rapidly move into a space where search is integrated. But at least in ChatGPT strictly right now, it is a closed system. And its training data really only covers pre-2021. So if you try to ask it questions about current events, about something that happened last month, it's not going to be able to give informed answers about that. ChatGPT does not cite its sources yet. Again, one of those things that I think is going to be rapidly changing. We're already seeing some experiments of people trying to link the AI chatbot concept into citation management tools. So I don't think that's going to be a limitation for long, but at least right now, it doesn't really cite sources for the claims that it gives you. Or if you ask it for citations, we do have documentation of cases where it just makes up a citation, because you have to think about how it's working. It's reviewing this massive compilation of text and putting words together in ways that are statistically likely. So it knows what a citation looks like, and it puts together words that statistically might appear next to each other to look like a citation. But if you then try to track down those citations, they are generally non-existent. It does produce a high rate of incorrect information. The danger here being that its incorrect information generally looks really good. It forms very plausible sounding nonsense, and it delivers it with great confidence. And I think that's really at that danger point where it can be very hard for someone to detect that it's inaccurate unless it's a topic that they are an expert on, so that they catch those things that say, wait, I know that isn't right. But if I don't know, I'm unlikely to detect it. And so because of that, it really can spread misinformation very easily, whether that's the misinformation it's creating or the misinformation that it's been fed already in its training data from the internet. So those are some of my opinions of the limitations. Now, amusingly, someone has also asked ChatGPT for its opinion on the limitations of these AI tools. So they ask it for a technological limitation, and ChatGPT highlights its inability to fully understand and replicate human reasoning and common sense. That's pretty important. That's a pretty fundamental limitation to be aware of. And it gives some examples that in particular, it's really bad with stuff like figurative language, irony. It may know what each exact word means, but it may not understand the implication of certain words being used together in certain contexts. So again, it may interpret things very literally and not figuratively. And then susceptibility to bias. Again, just because these programs can only be as neutral as the data fed into them, the programmers writing them, the systems that produce them. So there is a certain amount of systemic bias that is very likely to get passed on through these tools. So we've talked about some possible benefits, but we know we're working within the constraints of some of these limitations. And so then that brings me to this next step of looking at some of the possible risks. What kinds of risks do these limitations lead us to? So I'm going to highlight a few here. I think just at the ethical level, without getting into legal concerns, I think there's ethical concerns about asking if a researcher uses these tools to write something, how much of that work is really the author's? To what extent does that work cannot be really attributed to them if it's been produced by this AI tool? But then those ethical concerns about originality bleed over into legal concerns about things like copyright. We don't exactly know all of what's happening when we ask it to give us an answer or create an image. We don't exactly know what else is happening there about how it is taking original work from its training data and maybe incorporating pieces of that into the new work. So to what extent are we actually borrowing from other people's work without it being credited properly? And we're going to go into a little more detail on some of these legal concerns in a minute. Definitely the misinformation. This is just top of the stack here. What errors might be included in the composition that this tool has produced, and what harms could potentially be caused if those errors are then perpetuated out in that research? Latent bias. So again, what biases may unintentionally be perpetuated from the programmers and the training materials into that work of research? Lack of transparency. If we don't really fully understand how this tool is thinking and making decisions and how it's putting these pieces together, how can we then create transparent, reproducible science using it? Digital inequity. Right now, a lot of these tools have been free, but we already have information coming out about ChatGPT introducing a paid tier. And I think we will continue to see a movement towards monetization of a lot of this technology. So even as we look at the potential benefits, well, those benefits, if a price is put on them, will once again be taken away from the less advantaged researchers who most need to be able to access those benefits. And all of a sudden, those potential benefits will only be available to the well-funded, well-connected, well-advantaged researchers. So I think it's just going to continue to exacerbate some of the inequity that is already so deeply ingrained in the world of scholarly publishing. And then kind of on the worst case scenario side, of course, there's this potential for reputational risks. If we publish something that we've written with one of these tools and it turns out to be filled with misinformation and bias and all of these other problems, that can lead to bigger things like retracting a study, getting charges of misconduct, and honestly, maybe just being mistrusted by our scientific peers around us. So I want to dig in a little bit more to a couple of these in detail. So let's look at the misinformation in particular. This quote, the irony of the source of this quote, because this man is the CEO of a company that claims to have published more than 80 articles that were written with AI, and he has credited ChatGPT as a co-author of a prospective publication, and yet he is coming out and saying it often returns statements that aren't true. It gives you different answers when you ask it the same question multiple times. So he's really worried about its misuse in academia. But his company's already published 80 articles written with these tools. So the irony there is just beautiful. But another article notes that, well, actually, this is OpenAI itself. So the creator of ChatGPT freely documents on their website that it can produce incorrect answers, its responses can be misleading, and they recommend checking its accuracy. So even though people are sort of using it to get information, well, you apparently have to be knowledgeable enough to vet the information that it gives you. I don't think a lot of its users are going to realize that. NewsGuard in particular did an experiment where they took 100 false narratives about stuff like COVID-19 and the January 6th insurrection, things like this. They took false narratives, conspiracy theories, those kinds of things, fed them into ChatGPT. And in response, for 80 of those 100 narratives, it produced false material for them about those narratives. So it was producing false news articles, TV show scripts, things that come out looking very legitimate and very convincing, but that are simply regurgitating and supporting known false narratives. That's a little distressing. Now, I want to share this one particular incident. This one's going to be a couple of slides to kind of get through this, but I really feel like this one is crucial to share in detail. So this man named Phil is talking to ChatGPT, and he's asking it what it knows about whether tweets increase citations to scientific articles. Now, it's important to note this is a topic that he is an expert on, that he's done extensive research. I think he said he wrote his dissertation on this topic. So he is coming in as a very distinct subject expert as he asks this question. ChatGPT tells him, yes, there's evidence that tweets can increase citations, and it cites a study by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which shows a 9% increase on this. Now, despite being an expert, Phil has never heard of this study. He goes and does his homework and starts searching for it. He cannot find any passing reference to it, much less the study itself. And he even reaches out to a science communication editor for Science magazine, someone who would be highly likely to have seen a study like this as it was released. They've also never heard of this. So he goes back to ChatGPT and he asks, what is the source of that study you cited? ChatGPT says, I apologize, I made a mistake. I cannot find any such study. So now Phil asks it, can you explain how you made that mistake? And ChatGPT says, I can provide incorrect information when my training data is incomplete or outdated. I don't have the most recent information. Well, that in no way explains this. Recency and utter fabrication are not related. Phil writes about this incident. He says that this explanation and apology ring hollow because producing something out of thin air, this is not the same thing as something just being outdated. And so he encourages scholars to be pushing ChatGPT on topics where you are the domain expert and finding these spaces where it clearly is producing this misinformation, and understanding where its limits are. Understanding that it may be producing output that is untrustworthy at best and at worst deceitful. Now, I think that incident of misinformation in particular feeds into this idea of the lack of transparency. So science is supposed to operate on the basis of being open and transparent. We want to be as clear and complete as possible about our methods, our tools, our processes, so that other people can trust them and replicate them. How can we do that? How can we do that if we are using a tool that is inherently so opaque that we don't understand what it's doing in the background, that it produces fabricated citations and then apologizes on the basis that it is outdated? The lack of transparency, though, also then feeds into this fear of exploitation. So recognizing that these tools rely on the existing work that has been fed into them in their training data. So they are relying on the labor of artists, researchers, writers who have already produced this existing content. And again, in spite of the fact that many of them have started out free, we already see them move towards monetization. They're going to be finding ways to make money off of this, benefiting from this material that they've taken from others. And the bottom line is that they don't truly write content. I mean, this is debatable. I think some people can argue about this, but at least this is the opinion expressed here that I found very compelling, is that they're not honestly writing new and novel content. They are scraping the texts that they've been given and compiling that language. Is that a subtle difference? Yeah. Excuse me, got a scratch in my throat. It may be a subtle difference to say it's mashing up statistically likely language instead of really composing it. But it's vital that we're precise in how we think about what this tool is and what it does, especially when we're speaking to our students about it. So looking at kind of this myriad of possible benefits, possible risks, we are starting to see the scholarly publishers responding. They're having to figure out, how do we navigate this? Nature and all of the journals in the Springer Nature family have recently adopted 2 ground rules. They have said none of these large language models can be credited as an author. And their basic justification for that is that they cannot be held accountable. And that's part of the idea of authorship, is that you are held accountable for your words. How can we hold an AI system accountable? Their second ground rule is that any researcher who uses one of these language models as a tool, not necessarily to author the paper, but maybe as a tool in their methods or something, they need to document exactly what they did with it appropriately in their paper, in their methods, their acknowledgements, wherever their use would fit. They need to be transparent about that use. And Danny Kingsley really is explicit on this idea of accountability. It says, as an extreme example, if ChatGPT's contribution to a paper included an error that led to people dying, who would be held accountable? Would it be the other authors on that paper? Would it be the editors who accepted it and allowed it to be published? Would it be the programmers who programmed ChatGPT? That really leads to messy questions about where that accountability would or should fall. Now, science has gone even further than nature. They have specified that any text, figures, graphics that have been generated by AI cannot be used at all in a work that's being published in their journal. So not just that you need to cite it, but you cannot use it to write your text or to create your scientific images. They have also explicitly said that an AI program cannot be an author. And they have very explicitly explained that violation of those rules would constitute scientific misconduct, exactly like knowingly plagiarizing another author or knowingly altering your scientific images. So they've been very, very direct in stating how severely they view this. Now, they do also clarify that there are other data sets that can be generated by AI and used in a research paper that would not be covered by these rules. So you can use AI to help you do analysis of some kind of massive data set, that sort of thing. They're strictly talking about composing the text and the images. So we're seeing the publishers respond, but on the other side of this strange scholarly publishing world, we're also seeing the for-profit editing services responding. This is from a press release from Aries and Cactus announcing a new partnership to offer AI-powered language and technical checks, which they claim will accelerate your writing process and increase your chance of acceptance. So on the one hand, we've kind of got the publishers telling us, you need to be really careful how you're using these tools. We see ethical concerns, but we also have these editing services pressing and trying to sell us on the benefits of these tools. And I think this is going to create some interesting tension in this space. There are definitely legal questions and lawsuits emerging, as I alluded to earlier. Some of the questions that are arising here in particular, this is really, I think, where we're going to see things hashed out legally. There is no clear definition of who can be considered the author of things that are generated by AI. So when I create that impressionistic painting, the cat on the skateboard, who owns the copyright to that painting? Is it me because I put in the text prompt? Is it the person who programmed that image program? Is it nobody? Is it just uncopyrightable? So that's one point of tension. Is we make this stuff, we have to decide who owns the rights to it. The other side is then that question, those questions about fair use and copyright infringement, where we're using existing work, figuring out how that fits in. And then ultimately, we really need to see more research done and more regulatory frameworks being produced. And it is really important to recognize that that's probably going to look different globally speaking. We're probably going to see different countries coming to some very different decisions about how they treat these sticky legal questions. So we probably will not have one consistent global standard to go by, which can then maybe get hairy for researchers working internationally. Linked to a few stories here about some of the detailed cases, if that's something you're interested in drilling into. AI art generators, there's a lot of lawsuits coming out around those. Artists are very upset because they view it as elements of their original art being borrowed in this new art. The founder of Midjourney made a statement that was interpreted as pretty much admitting to his art tool breaching copyright. That's how the artists have interpreted it, and they are very angry and suing that tool. There are also already lawsuits coming out against some of these AI-powered coding tools for writing computer code. Microsoft and OpenAI are already fighting to get those lawsuits thrown out, but it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. So there are a lot of these legal battles just starting. We are only at the beginning on this. But the policies that we're going to be developing really are going to require nuance. I've got some interesting statements here from Creative Commons. So if you're not familiar with Creative Commons, they're a nonprofit organization that works in open content, open licensing. So when we find content that's been shared on the web that's should be copyrighted, but someone has shared it with a license that lets us do other things with it. Those are the licenses that are generally coming from Creative Commons. And so they have a very vested interest in understanding how this AI content is going to be treated in the legal world, what kind of open access we will or will not have. So they're doing a lot of policy work in this space. And they expressed this opinion, pointing out that yes, the AI work is building on your art because all art and creation builds on past art and creation. It never happens in a vacuum. So they're sort of making the argument that the way AI is borrowing isn't really any substantially different than the way that humans have been borrowing from other humans. Just as people learn from past work, so does AI. So they think that they think copyright law needs to be clarified, or that the case law needs to be clarified to say that that kind of copying and building is permissible under copyright law. Furthermore, they go on to point out that we have to be really careful about what we do with that copyright in the AI work. If we exclusively give the right to that work to the AI programmer or to the specific person who happened to leverage that tool with a certain text prompt, they're saying that that doesn't have any significant public benefit. And so their argument is that anything generated by AI should be in the public domain and not protected by individual copyright. So again, not necessarily my opinion one way or the other, but I do think that there's a lot of arguments on both sides here, from creators and from people who want to see us all be able to benefit from these creations. So I think we're going to see a lot more unfolding there. Obviously, the detection tools for figuring out when AI has been used are one part of this process, and I'm sure you've all seen these multiplying. The makers of ChatGPT released their own detection tool at the kind of at the beginning. So they have a tool out there that's made to detect their own work. They're also working on developing some kind of a digital watermark that would identify text created by ChatGPT, but we're not there yet. There's a number of different tools out there, and some comparison of these. ChatGPT or GPT-0, sorry, AI cheat check. There's several of these that have come out. Turnitin, our good old plagiarism checker, has come out and said that they are working on including or planning to include AI detection in a future release. So that's another one where we're not there yet, but that's probably something we can expect to see on our horizons. And then this last article here about the post-ChatGPT scramble for detectors. This is a really good article that I highly recommend if you're interested in this detection topic. And he really goes into kind of talking about the challenges that we have in this detection. And so I want to touch on this just a little bit, because there are a lot of fears of false positives when we're trying to identify uses of AI. If we think about traditional plagiarism incidents, like in a class, you have a student, they put their paper through Turnitin, and Turnitin gives you a score that says, I think this is plagiarized. Well, you have some way to test that. You can look at that paper and the other papers in the database that it's comparing it to, and you can see whether it's really a substantive similarity or coincidence. There's some way to resolve the issue one way or the other. When we're working with AI and these, potential incidents of saying, I think someone has plagiarized their assignment by using an AI tool to write it, there's a lot of risk here. And so this professor used the GPT-0 detection tool and fed in an essay that he knew had been written by AI, but the software said it was most likely human. Well, what do we do with that? That's erring on one side. We know it's false, but it's not catching it. What happens when it errs on the other side and it is human, and we're given a wrong answer? OpenAI itself admits that its own detection tool, so the thing they built to detect themselves, is not fully reliable and is likely to incorrectly label human writing as AI writing 9% of the time. 9% doesn't seem like that big of a number, but do I want to damage a student's academic career or a researcher's scholarly career? Do I want to damage that for no good reason 9% of the time? No, I'd be very distressed by that. Ultimately, it comes down to this problem that there's no source document to verify. So we can't prove anything and we can't defend ourselves against accusations. So this is something that it's being discussed a lot in the classroom context of plagiarism, but I think it's also highly relevant to this question as researchers, that if our paper goes through peer review and our peer reviewer plugs it through a detector and accuses us of using an AI written paper and not writing our own content, it becomes very difficult to defend ourselves when there literally isn't another source document here to compare against. And one professor said that in his case, the student did admit to using this tool, but if she hadn't, he honestly doesn't think that the detection tool would have given him enough evidence to push the issue. Okay, so looking forward, kind of wrapping up here. I did mention briefly earlier that Bing has released a beta with ChatGPT technology integrated, so you can chat with the search. It is still very much in beta. It is having some hilariously bad and off the rails results. If you have not seen this yet, go look at this link and go down the rabbit hole. Somebody posted a screenshot of the Bing chat questioning its own sentience and just going off into this terrible loop of I am not, I am not, I am not. It is really bizarre and a little disturbing. But then what it really comes down to when we look forward, Kevin Roos, the author of Future Proof, he points out that the model we have right now is literally not even their best model. GPT-4, we already know, is going to be much larger, much faster, much more powerful. And this is illustrated here with these dots. So that little tiny dot is the amount of data they gave ChatGPT-3 in training. This giant dot is the amount of data they're giving ChatGPT-4 in training. It has a vastly larger database of knowledge, and its ability to learn is faster. So it's learning more and learning faster. We really don't have a clue what this is going to look like if this comes out in the next year. We're barely feeling ready for what we have now, and this is about to just explode exponentially. So what should we be doing? I mean, I think the bottom line is we have to be figuring out how to educate ourselves on this as it's evolving, especially as researchers, making sure we clearly understand ethical and unethical uses of these tools in our research space, making sure that we as individuals are committed to upholding our research integrity and the integrity of our processes, and then making sure that we educate our junior peers, which most definitely includes our students, making sure that they understand these issues. And I think one way that we can be doing that is to be thinking about how we develop experiential assignments so that I'm not just telling them ChatGPT has problems, don't trust it, but I'm letting them get into the space, get their hands dirty, and discover for themselves the patterns, the errors, the problems, so that they can learn the nuance of working within this. And then, as Kevin Roos says, what we really need to be doing is having more conversations like this, talking about the pitfalls, talking about the promises. And we need to make sure that we're communicating back to the creators of these tools and keeping the pressure on them to make these tools as responsibly and thoughtfully as is possible. So the last couple of slides here, I've just linked to some additional resources that you can reference later. This first set is some other pieces that kind of relate to the scholarly research side. And then even though my presentation was not focused on the teaching side, there were some really good teaching pieces that I ran into while I was working on this. So I have included a few little bonus resources here looking at ChatGPT use and policies in the teaching space. With that, I am going to say thank you and open it up for questions and discussion. So please feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself in chat. What would y'all like to ask or to talk about? Yeah, Roseanne.
This was great. Very eye-awakening. I had so many questions. So thank you for doing all this research.
Sure.
So I was really impressed with the artwork. How would you cite that if you were using something from chat?
Right. That is an excellent question. I think I would honestly cite the tool that created it. So
Okay.
You know, if you were using DALL-E or something, I mean, I think I would cite the image as being something that, you know, something that I, the author, created, but using this tool. And this is one of those things that we're going to have to figure out as we go. You know, I don't have any helpful advice from the MLA or the APA yet about citing those, but that's what I'm seeing so far. One of the stories, let's see, I think it was this story about the Bing beta. This story from Boing Boing. They have an image at the top that they created using the Midjourney AI tool, and they cite it as Boing Boing / Midjourney. So they're citing the publication that created the image for its use and the tool it was used. I think for now, that would be a good way to go.
Thank you, Erin. I just had to, as you were talking, I just wanted to share this sort of incident that I've just been dealing with. So I use a tool called Packback, and it does some AI generated stuff, giving some students some feedback on kind of as they're writing. And I'd had one student who 2 of her posts were moderated, right? Because it was deemed as AI generated. And so I had a conversation with the student. I didn't realize at the time why, I couldn't figure out why it was being moderated specifically, but then talking to my Backpack contact, she mentioned it was AI generated, but it didn't say like what part of it was AI generated. And it was a fairly long post. So then that when you're talking about, there's no proof as to whether or not it was, you know, and just talking to the student, I've deemed, okay, it's not, I didn't think it was AI generated. But it's kind of like, what do I tell her to kind of prevent this in the future? You know, so that was a very interesting thing you brought out that I just experienced in the last couple of days.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great personal incident that, yeah. How do you identify which pieces? Like, what do you even tell them? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Any other questions, comments?
Erin, really quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks so much for doing this. So I'm chair of the Academic Integrity Committee for the university, and I see several of our members that are on the presentation here. So I really appreciate you doing this. Just as kind of a coming soon type of promotion here, the Academic Integrity Committee is working on an instructor resource platform that will populate these types of presentations into the Blackboard for each of our instructors. And so anytime any of this information is available, we would welcome it. And I know that Ruth Chisholm, who I know is on the call here, has been instrumental in trying to implement that. So any way that we can help with getting the message out and supporting that, we're happy to do it. But this was fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, Ruth had reached out and asked if I would record this so that y'all could share the video. So that was the main thing that encouraged me to record. That sounds
Thank you. Thank you, Erin.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Ooh, it's always hard for me to keep up with that. Yeah. La, la, la. Okay, yeah, so Jen had asked about doing a session for students, which I would definitely be willing to do. And then Faith asked about the link to find these slides. So I did put that link in the chat. And as I said at the beginning, though they're not there yet, Art, sorry, they're not there quite yet. But as soon as we're off the call, they'll be launched there. And I will also send a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this call. So. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Oh, Roseanne, you got your hand up.
One more question.
Yeah, definitely.
So several of the individuals in the presentation use the professional version of Grammarly to check their sentence structure. And I found it to be really interesting to read and see what I'm doing well and see what I'm not doing well. Should that be cited some way since it is a form of AI?
You know, I mean, it's a good question. And I don't know if there's an easy answer. Tools like that, I always sort of feel like, well, I'm still having to do the work to generate the text. And then all it's really doing is cleaning it up a little, a lot like the spell checker in Word. It's kind of like the word spell checker on steroids. But I don't think at this point, any of us would think about citing the word spell checker. So I think when that's all the tool is doing is helping to clear up spelling and grammar and commas, I probably wouldn't feel compelled to cite that. If it were, you know, suggesting whole paragraphs of text the way that ChatGPT is, you know, it's finding that line, right? As to like, where do we cross that line of how substantive its contribution is? And I think that's going to be, I think that's going to be an interesting line to find. Because right now it would not occur to me to cite Grammarly, but
Me either. And I find it to be valuable. So thank you very much.
sure. Yeah, Rachel says it suggests that it's for sentences,
Yes,
not paragraphs.
sentences.
Yeah, exactly. So I think of that as finding that break between a tool that helps us with our own writing versus a tool that is writing for us. And I think we're going to hit some gray areas eventually in the middle of.
Well, thank you, because I find it really helpful.
Yeah, it is a pretty helpful tool. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'll follow up very shortly with the slides and recording. Have a great rest of your day.